Welcome to Deleted Saves. On this episode, Final Fantasy XVI on PS5. Listeners, it is not often I come back to a series long after I have given up on it, through its sequels, reinterpretations, and derivatives. It is even less often that if I do, I realize I just had to give up on what I was experiencing again because more interesting things came along. I gave this one the best shot I could, folks. But let's get into it, as I played and ultimately abandoned 2023's Final Fantasy XVI. The last mainline entry in the Final Fantasy series I personally played was Final Fantasy XII. It struck me as a single-player MMO light, something to bring back the players who'd skipped out on Final Fantasy XI, which seemed to be trying too hard and too late to capitalize on the success of World of Warcraft, or maybe bridge that gap numbered sequels because it is now, in the fullness of time, quite obviously Square Enix's attempt to go in that direction. It was certainly a game. The last Final Fantasy game I actually enjoyed, however, was Final Fantasy IX. Things began to go so poorly for me, in my opinion of the series, was the introduction of Final Fantasy X, which I did play to completion with a guide, and I personally found to be an utterly miserable experience. Yes, I know a lot of you out there have much more fond memories of that title, and yeah, I can't argue with your fucking rose-colored glasses on this subject. But as this is my show and my opinion still stands that Final Fantasy X was a pure capsaicin and diarrhea smoothie we are all collectively being waterboarded with. Since I was playing Final Fantasy X concurrently with Silent Hill 2, I almost quit gaming entirely between those two games, thinking that if this is what the best of the greats in the industry could do at the time, then it was time for the industry to die. Thankfully, others took that mantle away from them. So after Final Fantasy XII, I was done. I didn't play whatever Final Fantasy XIII was, and it's got mixed reviews, and like so many games, I have heard people think we should be re-evaluating it, which is a bit unfair if you ask me, because the dead cannot defend themselves, and there is a reason we don't prosecute corpses even if they were guilty. Final Fantasy XIV was an MMO again, and anytime a company says anything along the lines of MMO or online focused or arena shooter or anything along those lines, you can always count me out, because I simply have no interest in that shit. And it's likely as the industry speeds recklessly towards always online, realistic, anything is possible forced multiplayer simulation akin to the Star Trek holodeck, that will be the thing that gets me to quit gaming, because I play games to get the fuck away from people. And I don't know what Final Fantasy XV was, but I am to understand it was something about Hot Boy Summer and an on-rails Cadillac ride, which I'm sure was somebody's fantasy. So I was well away from the series by this point, only dabbling back in to play Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I quite liked, and is a game to which the fanboy whining and pissboy whining on either side has yet to stop. This is why, as a rule, I stay away from fandoms and quote-unquote communities in gaming. But something about Final Fantasy XVI stood out much differently to me than its last several predecessors. From the announcement trailer to the demo of the game, something made me want to return to the series in a way that I had not felt in almost 2 decades. And well, I did. Final Fantasy XVI is focused solely on one character, Clive Rossfield, the eldest son of royal family of the nation of Rosaria, who, for reasons we will not learn for some time, fails to become the dominant of the Phoenix icon. Translated in English for the rest of us, that means he tried to become the host of a raw power of this fabled ancient being of fire, so that it can be utilized in battle against the various political foes of his homeland. But the being rejected him as a host. The Phoenix instead chose his younger brother Joshua, so the line of succession will pass to this child. Clive will instead become his brother's bodyguard, which, to Clive's credit, he's not really bothered by. The person who is bothered is his mother, who is a real fucking piece of shit right out of the gate, maltreating anyone who cannot afford her greater power or greater anything else, such as her husband and eldest son when she grows tired of them. When I say you are focused slowly on Clive, that is because this is an action RPG. Well, sort of. It's more like a semi-linear brawler with some progression elements. Clive is our protagonist. He never gets more interesting beyond maturing from optimistic youth to embittered adult. And you will get a few tag-along characters in the form of one other NPC who only sorta helps out, and your dog, who carries most fights as a damage per second machine. And this is what we get. It is not a party-based role-playing game like so many of its predecessors, each person with a special skill or the like. Clive has to be all of them, and it turns out his special skill is sort of absorbing a few talents from other icon holders and using them badly. Clive starts out as the all-too-common 16-year-old wonderkind, sort of a tradition in Japanese role-playing games, where the whole society is considered useless and nearly dead by age 30, which must be very difficult to live under as a social culture, considering it would seem millions of its citizens only have about 15 good years before they are relegated to the trash heap of human history. Yes, I know some of you listening have lived there or in countries nearby to Japan and would argue, but dude, check yourself. We, at least, give you until 35 here. Clive lives in a world of haves and have-nots, and he is very much a privileged have. He also lives in a world where slavery is common, particularly those people who have magic as an inborn talent. Those who can cast even the slightest of spells are put into chains and made to burn themselves out unto death, as in this world magic is tied to a substance called the Mother Crystals, and with each spell one casts, the caster is drawn one day closer to dying by turning to stone. It is also a world where everyone is fighting to control these Mother Crystals, but it would seem a creeping rot known as the Blight is spreading out from these crystals, and everyone is speeding themselves towards their own doom. On a mission to escort his brother, Joshua, to the ancient family fortification where he will commune with the Phoenix and become the dominant of fire, Clive is forced to fight through and witness the betrayal of his family forces by an enemy nation who go on to seemingly slaughter his whole family, his childhood friend Jill, his dog, his favorite war chicken Chocobo, the series' staple animal, and ultimately his brother's death at the hands of a cursed dominant of fire known as Ifrit, as, when in a panic Joshua becomes the Phoenix, the other beast surges forth to kill the Phoenix for ownership of the title of Fire God. When dawn arrives and Clive is barely conscious, swearing a bitter and mumbling revenge, his mother rolls in with her guards, an arm of the guys who got done murdering her husband and kids, and has Clive trussed up in chains and dragged off for a life of magic slavery, which is where we meet him as an adult later on, a slaver's brand tattooed on his face, and a soldier forced to fight in the wars of the nation who owns him until victory or death. Slavery and its effects will come up frequently in Final Fantasy XVI, but to be honest, very cartoonishly. Everyone who is all for slavery is so on the side of enslaving and mistreating magic users that they are so much mustache-twirling, nose-picking villains who are about one voice-acted line away from tying the nearest damsel in distress to the most conveniently placed set of railroad tracks. It's kind of ridiculous. Anyone against slavery is a paragon of virtue by comparison, but who are somehow just too fucking inept about it because they are not the main character and his buddies, and therefore require the player to enact their will to make social change. The writing in this often feels like the folks at Square Enix just recently found out about slavery as a concept, and that it was a bad thing done by bad men for bad reasons. It otherwise misses the subtle, insidious nature of slavery by a country mile in favor of oversimplification. Let's take America's own history on the subject. Sure, there were paragons of virtue and snidely whiplash-level dime novel caricatures of human beings, but many pro-slavery people were often too poor to own slaves themselves, and were angry that enslaved people were doing jobs that they could do but wanted to get paid to do, or were just racists. And not every abolitionist saw the end of slavery as a moral imperative. Sure, some were afraid of how God would judge them after death, although God's pretty okay with slavery if you read the good book. Others were thinking more of the economics of slavery, or about how having a freed workforce might be better to expand the nation, or were experiencing guilt and thought it would be better return those poor, misbegotten lesser people back to Africa where they belonged, as God had ordained. Neither group gave one iota of a shit about the plight of native peoples, or of Chinese immigrants, or of the immigrant countries of Europe deemed lesser or more beneath their English or Swedish or French roots, and actively sought to harm all. Slavery is far more nuanced a subject than a Final Fantasy game to ever hope to portray, and to be honest, it's insulting how it's dealt with here. But moving on. Clive will eventually get himself free and become an escaped slave on the run. Rescuing who he will find out later is his friend Jill, all grown up, and who is now the dominant of ice, I guess, in control of Shiva, who will only show up in a cutscene as she isn't the main character, and will meet the leader of the slave revolt named Sid, who in the English dub of this game is voiced by Ralph Ineson, whose voice for the character is truly the most magical part of this game, like the vocal cords of a six-pack-a-day smoker floating on a sea of liquid gold. That voice could recite the dictionary verbatim into a microphone and it would still be a worthwhile product. Sid puts Clive on the path to taking down other nations of the world, to stop the spread of the Blight, and to stop the enslavement of magic users and their allies. And that is where the game goes from there, watching cartoonish villagers and thugs kick people while they are down, while Clive grunts and rasps and attempts his best Shakespearean monologues about how he plans to kill his brother's killer and how he'll stop his mother's evil. Look, let's point out something painfully obvious to us, the players, yet something Clive rather ridiculously and conveniently ignores on the path to his revenge quest. Clive is Ifrit. The game makes no secret of this. Clive just chooses to ignore the fact and that he killed his brother 13 years earlier. Only he didn't because it quickly becomes obvious Joshua is still alive and well and knows Clive is the cursed dominant, but at no point shows up to talk to him about it. There's no startling revelations here or twists the player didn't see coming, as the writing team has telegraphed absolutely everything. Along the way, Clive kills another dominant named Benedicta, from whom he steals part of her wind powers. And although the writers do try to make you feel sorry for her, she's honestly so awful, I just couldn't muster sympathy for her death. And Clive learns he can use bits of other dominant powers to further his action game skills. Plus, grinding for levels in a semi-open world. My god, the grinding. A lot of Final Fantasy titles have included grinding for levels as part of the gameplay, but holy shit, this game is more like fighting through a human zoo. You can see the walls, you know they are fake and you are in a prison, but you have to hunt down and kill all the other critters who mostly just want to be left alone, or will either ignore you entirely until you start stabbing them, or hone in on your location like a heat-seeking missile with Clive's nave on it. Most of your fights for item upgrade parts, hit point increases, and skill points to add to your Streets of Rage type abilities. Let's put a pin in that reference. The side missions are pointless unless you need 30 gnome skulls or frog toes to upgrade your sword or fashion belt to make you slightly more powerful. Otherwise, there is no reason not to beeline the main plot. About halfway through, I think, Clive goes home and finds the holy cave beneath the fort where his family died years earlier and enters it, only to discover another fiend known as Ultima is tied to how the mother crystals are turning bad and that only he can stop it. Sid dies in this fight and he bequeaths his lightning powers to Clive, completing, I think, his ability list. I've said I think twice now. as shortly after this we do another 5-year time skip. Clive is now hiding out with Jill and his dog, recruiting new ex-slaves, as the last batch got slaughtered at his new Badlands hideout, and I just realized I was bored. Horrifically bored with this plot and the game, and I put it down. The months rolled by, and other games came and went, and I just wasn't very interested in returning to Final Fantasy XVI, especially halfway through the game and months after I'd forgotten how the controls worked. I wasn't interested in restarting the drawn-out cutscenes, gorgeous as they were, or the melodrama of the story just to remind myself what was happening. I wasn't hooked. And I was done. Sure, I could look up the ending on Wikipedia and try to shovel that shit for you, dear listeners, but I don't want to, and I would feel very disingenuous about it. I'm not really sure I care how this game ends, yet I did feel I needed to speak with you about it. And for now, Clive recruiting his new slave army is where the game ended for me. The professional critics were nice enough to Final Fantasy XVI, most praising its attempts to handle darker themes and a more mature cast, and found the voice actors likable. But just as many found the whole thing to be underdeveloped. The themes and characters, especially the female characters, poorly resolved and handled badly. Yeah, I can see that. The game itself is around 87 out of 100 on Metacritic and has sold about 3 million units as of the time of this recording. However, it was recently come to light that Square Enix has found the sales figures to be a problem, saying that Final Fantasy XVI and other titles launched throughout 2023 and 2024 failed to reach internal sales goal figures for what was spent upon them. This is where Square Enix is starting to have the EA Games or Ubisoft problem, where they are making flashy shit, and when it doesn't hit some sort of internal metric that we, the public, are not privy to, they will begin to cut down on riskier or niche titles in favor of mass-produced but guaranteed successes, and for which we, the consumer, will suffer for their lack of willingness to take risks or produce what their diverse customer bases may want, instead of funneling everything into the whales and loudest voices. But I've made this argument before, and, well, there's very little choice in the matter because no one gives enough of a shit. Or at least those who could change things don't plan to because it would hurt their bottom line and we all have to accept it. This is a business complaint that will unfortunately affect future product decisions and may, in the end, make a worse product down the line. But enough about what the paid advertisers have to say. Here's how Final Fantasy, as an experience, shook out for me. This particular story is, overall, very Game of Thrones inspired. Lots of backstabbing, familicide, betrayals, and darker, more mature themes in the way Hollywood loves its darker, more mature things, such as full of sex, sleaze, and stage drama. But if the writers were confronted with the real genuine darkness and evil of the human condition, they would shit themselves blind out of reflex. Hell, I probably would too. But this is a high fantasy story in a world of magic and monsters. The problem I have here is that this is a story about Clive, a rich boy suddenly brought low, but who will rise again to his status. Not the type of story I personally care for. I'll illustrate my point. Many years ago, I read a book series by author Simon R. Green, a British sci-fi and fantasy author. The series was called Deathstalker, and it was a clear parody of old sci-fi franchises such as Flash Gordon, Lost in Space, but more specifically Star Wars. But behind it, it was poking fun at neo-feudalism and our modern willingness to commit ourselves, rather unthinkingly, to a return to an autocratic society where a lord, or a baron, or a king makes all the decisions for you, and all you need to do is follow along and do what you are told, and never ask too many questions or try to rise above where and who you are. It also means that you are the automatic enemy of any person or group that stands up for themselves or stands in opposition to your lord's ideals. If someone dies who's not a member of your society or runs counter to that society's rules or ethics of unspoken codes, even though, even though you have as much blood on your hands as the one who pulled the trigger or drew the blade across their neck, but you are without guilt because everyone is guilty, meaning no one is really guilty because you cannot place guilt on an entire society. Well, you can, but as humans, we fail to do that, brushing aside our own genocides and horrors inflicted on one another while pointing that out in everyone else when they do it. In the background of this book setting, the most popular show in the known universe of humanity is a show called The Quality, in which the backstabbing and hero worship of a royal family is a subtle nod to the insistence of certain power bases within the setting to return to autocracy and the right of kings because it is better for the seething, stinking masses to be handled when they just don't have to do all that damn thinking for themselves. It's propaganda, but most people feel hopeless and without direction, and they're easily drawn to it. It's a good series. Check it out if you can, although it did come out in the 1990s. That's who and what Clive is. The Quality. The main character. The only one who can affect change in a corrupt society. He was a sheltered lad who suddenly got shaken out of his nest but will rise again to a state of protection because he's just, a good dude. This is exactly how I got drawn out of the story. This is a glaring point that this fantasy story presents. In real history, no real or influential person, not the entertainers or sports stars or clowns of our society that when things go bad and happen beyond our understanding, the media turns to for comment instead of putting the screws to power with a capital P as they should. While they may not have directly caused it, they are certainly getting paid because of it. No real person of power has ever stood up for social change. They instead seek to reinforce their basis of power, to stay in control at all costs. There is almost never a truly good person that comes from privilege. Or if they were broken before their neo-feudalism and retreated to it. Genuine social change is always grassroots, not something that comes from the oppressive power structures, but by scaring power so badly that it concedes, at least for a little while. Clive is just a figurehead, and a rather thick-headed one at that. I'm sad that he is the star of the show. The other problem it took me quite a while to put my finger on, as to why I was struggling to enjoy this game, despite its extravagance and smooth play, and otherwise everything I should be enjoying, even if it was formulaic, was that it kept reminding me of something else. Something I also had trouble with long ago, until it dawned on me. Final Fantasy XVI is way too much like the bouncer for my liking or comfort. That's why I said put a pin in that Streets of Rage reference. If you're not aware, back in the year 2000, Square, before they became Square Enix, released a hybrid beat-em-up slash RPG called The Bouncer. And in the 24 years, there would be no sequels since then. It is a game of huge flash over substance, laden with about 3 hours worth of cutscenes and only about 20 minutes worth of actual gameplay, unless you insist on playing the game from all three main characters' perspectives. And then that will maybe get you about a solid hour of gameplay. They wanted to do something risky, and it fell flat on its face. It was universally crapped on, and I've even reviewed it some time ago to point out how bad it was. Sure, some folks liked it, but nowhere near enough. That action RPG formula that Square tried to create, not the kind found in most of the genre of the subgenre, is what I see on display here in Final Fantasy XVI. It is an upgraded, more smoothed out, but high fantasy trapped and draped The Bouncer. And why not use this idea? It is their property, after all. It's not like Square is ripping anyone off. You can disagree if you like, but that is the way I see it. And once my mind's made up, it's not easy to move me, or worth your time to do so, to be honest. But was that really all? No, it was not. Final Fantasy XVI is also a game that could have done wonders for an editor. There's a lot of bloat in this game, pointless side quests, collectathons for upgrade parts, no real compulsion to do anything beyond the main plot. You will often need to do bounty board quests to hunt monsters, but there is not storytelling behind them. Go to a location, monster will appear, and you kill it. Or you can go to the big crystal in your hideout and replay battles in certain levels and areas. You don't get anything for this beyond practice with the controls of your new powers, and I never did it again beyond once or twice. You can stop cutscenes and open up your control panel to read all the fucking lore that they wrote to cover and fill in the meaning behind the names and places and who and what and why all this even means for anything. But that is just as bad as lore dumping. I've read far too many authors over the years who have pages and pages of pages and pages about how to pronounce names or why the main characters talking about matters and why. And I get it, it is for lore building reasons. But that shit is only for the truly hardcore fanboys and girls. The rest of us just push past it because there is simply no time for that. Also, it's kind of bad storytelling. You can write a story or dialogue where the characters share references and work within world knowledge, without needing a goddamn reference sheet. The game itself is beautiful, don't get me wrong. Everyone is a handsome Chad or a pretty supermodel, even the plain people. Everyone is comely in a way that shows stark terror of making characters be regular people. Yeah, I get it. We want escapism and pretty people to fawn over and pretend to be as before we head back to our plain lives and ugly faces surrounding us. But all this stunning looks and realistic graphics and critters you could almost reach out and touch and pet adorning the screen is just somehow bland, vapid, more pointing out their unreality than anything. It sure made my PlayStation scream and whine, but I'm not sure it was worth the heat and the trouble. It's all very square. And as a teacher once said to me of my own art, all very expected. There's certainly no change to the formula, and I guess that is the way Square and Final Fantasy fans like it. I think I made the right choice when I tapped out after 12. My final verdict on Final Fantasy XVI, or at least what I played of it, is that it's fine. Fine for what it is, anyway. Nothing really worth writing home about. But it still sold 3 million copies. And that was before the PC release. Maybe it would have done better released on multiple platforms instead of being locked to the PlayStation. But its supposed failure means Christ only knows what we're in for the inevitable Final Fantasy XVII. Maybe a return to party-based formula. Maybe another MMO. Will it look like a crazy romance manga? Absolutely. Because why not make the characters' lips softer than cotton clouds when you could just show a more normal person in all their roughness? They'll pour all that into a budget instead of hiring better writers, or trying something a bit out of the norm like Final Fantasy IX. I don't think I'll be returning to Final Fantasy XVI, at least not anytime soon. Hell, this show will probably reach its end before I ever try it again. If I do come back around and change my mind, I'll certainly let y'all know, but don't bet on it. As a friend of ours says, it's okay to like a video game. And that is very true. But it is also okay to give up on a game. Give your opinion on it when you've gotten as far as you can, or gotten whatever you can stomach out of it. I'm not a charity here, nor am I some sort of, and I say this loosely, professional reviewer or YouTuber who needs to keep up their street cred by completing every game before they render a verdict. That is just an ugly way of thinking. I can at least say I tried my best, and it was still worth talking about. Just not replaying. Thank you for listening. Deleted Saves would like to thank Brad, Keith Gasper, Orden Wells, and Maslama for being patrons of the show. If you would like to become a patron of the show, please go to patreon.com and check out Deleted Saves Podcast. All donations go directly towards maintaining the show itself. Thank you.